Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video, interview, discussion, whatever you want to call it. And today I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Aaron Adair. Not for the first time, of course, I have interviewed him previously, interviewed him on this channel only sort of less than a month ago. So we have talked to quite some degree about this topic, and we also were privileged enough to be on Myth Vision with Derek Lambert together, where we had a three-way and we discussed a lot of this stuff as well. So I don't want this discussion to be repetitive and to be a copy of what we've already said. So we're going to talk about things that are slightly different, although obviously connected to what we've talked about before. So this will be nativity based, although we are going to then go on to talk about astrotheology a bit later. So that might be something to hook you in on. But before that, Dr. Adair, welcome back. Would you like to just give a very quick introduction to yourself to those who might not know you?
All right. So first off, good to be back here again. So yes, I can call myself doctor. I earned my PhD in physics from the Ohio State University. I am also continuing my physics research as a research associate at MIT, while also doing my day job as a data scientist. But of course, I also like to moonlight as a biblical scholar, so that I have published several books, articles, book chapters, ultimately related to the birth story of Jesus and how it relates to astronomy, or maybe more importantly, how it doesn't relate to astronomy.
And you can obviously, or not obviously, but you can find Dr. Adair at draaronadair.com. And here is his beautiful looking website. Him without a beard. You can cast your opinion as to what is a better look. Facial hair
there's one opinion that matters. It's my wife's. She says beard looks better, therefore beard is better.
Okay, there you go. You can't argue with that. Or you can, but I wouldn't. And the other place to look at is Amazon or any other, well, preferably some other retailer, because Jeff Bezos has got quite enough money. Thank you very much. But The Star of Bethlehem, a fantastic book with a foreword by Bob Berman. The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View, and this is what I think Richard Carrier called the go-to book on the Star of Bethlehem. It's, you know, people who have read it are really taken with the book. It's an excellent analysis of the Star of Bethlehem as it figures in the Bible, and you are writing either a second edition or a completely new version of this book. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm in the process of expanding some things, creating some new arguments, and also expanding out on the history of the interpretation of this. So I've pretty much tried to find everything I can in English, German, French, Latin, Greek, everything that I can of anyone who's ever talked about this subject, to trace out what that history is, what has caused the major changes to it, and from both in academia as well as the popular world, because sometimes the two are perfectly aligned, sometimes they're opposite. Sometimes popular affects the academic, sometimes vice versa. How that all gets so intertwined to get to where we are today is, I have found to be an interesting history, where along the way I can also like say, and here's like literally the history of biblical studies and why people make the conclusions they do now very different than they did say in 1700.
And I think this is a really good vehicle. The book, the Star of Bethlehem subject matter, is a really good vehicle to map out the history of science, because actually what you're doing is you're saying, here is astronomy and astrology in biblical times, and here is how people try to explain it throughout history in terms of naturalistic science and the stars and astronomy, as we got a greater and greater understanding of how the cosmos worked. And in that sense, this book is a fantastic sort of reflection upon that progress towards a scientific understanding of the heavens. I mean, would you agree?
Well, it's very hard for me to disagree, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a little close to home. It's like, no, this is a terrible book. You never would want this.
No, but as in it does reflect, because you're talking about that, well, actually this is how Copernicus understood, and so on and so forth. This is how these sort of famous astronomers understood and explained.
Yeah, and especially sometimes correcting things because, for example, often like one of the famous astronomers of the early modern period of the early scientific revolution, Johannes Kepler, he's very important to the story, but he's often grossly misinterpreted because they're trying to make him sound more modern than he actually was. He basically had like 1 foot in the magical past and 1 foot in the scientific future. And when he is discussing the nature of the star, he still sees it as completely supernatural, magical. But he also does try to, say, but with my scientific hypothesizing, heroes going up in the sky to make people pay attention. But fundamentally, that thing floating around, that was still guided by God to a particular location. And well, let's just say this much: not enough people are going back, reading what he said clearly, and then using his authority to stamp out and say how great the hypothesis is. It goes all the way back to the founders of science, but it doesn't.
Right, right. And I think an interesting place to start off in our analysis, critical evaluation of the nativity claims in both the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, is you were talking to me off camera about this chap, Mr. Woolston, because we are indeed challenging the historicity of the nativity, and are saying that we can do that these days without fear of being, having any ramifications on our personal or professional lives. So we're living in a period of being able to challenge prevailing ideas. But actually, going back to the 1700s, you were telling me about someone who was challenged very robustly for making claims about the nativity. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. At first, is kind of as a premise or a starting point. As much as we might, think of like Western Europe as a place for academic freedom or freedom of thought, freedom of speech, that was still extremely limited in the early modern period. For example, Isaac Newton had to keep secret that he didn't believe in the Trinity because that was basically a death penalty offense in England at that time. And he basically like confided it very, quietly to his friend John Locke, the philosopher, who then basically was influenced by that to say, you know what, we should do this whole religious freedom thing. So that way we're not, killing my buddy Newton, who just basically revolutionized all of physics and math. We're going to throw him away because of a theological disagreement. Come on, let's grow up, people.
Yeah.
I'm not using obviously Locke's language, but that sort of influence he had.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, in this early time that there's a lot of sacred cows in England. And one of them, is you're not supposed to come along and say the stories of the Bible are BS, which whatever nice language you might want to use. And the one gentleman that we mentioned, there's very little written about him, but one of the few books, this one here, the gentleman's name is Thomas Wilton. And this is one of the very few biographical texts out there. But most of Wilton's texts are on Google Books, so you can actually go and read those for free. They're from the 1720s. And he basically has this idea that he developed while he was still a student at Cambridge, that all the stories of the New Testament are completely allegorical. And if you try taking them as history, you're a dum-dum. So the way he writes his book is in this sort of scathing, sarcastic thing. It's like, oh, so you believe that? It feels like that, reading that page after page after page. It's a little bit grating, but he is applying this to the story of Jesus and saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. This is just complete nonsense. Come on, do we really want to believe in this magic stuff? He calls the Star of Bethlehem in particular a will-o'-the-wisps. Right. And in England at that time as well, that another term for that is fairy light. So he's literally calling the Star of Bethlehem a fairy tale.
Yeah.
And for doing that, he got himself into trouble, and he ended up going to rich person's jail for, some of the last months of his life he was there.
Interesting. So that, challenging the nativity in a very direct fashion got him into trouble. Whereas here we are 300 odd years later, and that's hopefully not the case. Hopefully you and I are both safe.
Yeah, I think more or less we are. And even so, even though he was, attacked in that sort of way, many thought that was an overreaction, and he still had influence. And apparently when he was selling his various pamphlets, one of the customers that he probably had a chat with and influence was Voltaire. There seems to be some evidence that the two of them probably met, that Voltaire read his stuff and kind of copied that sort of style of writing satire to attack theology. And this sort of thing would be also picked up by the early English deists, who would then go on to influence the German deists, who basically would then more or less found modern biblical studies.
So this guy could, in fact, have Wilton could, in fact, have more of an important role to play in higher biblical criticism than maybe anyone's given him credit for. Interesting.
Yeah. And as the cover mentions, though, like I say, he wasn't the most respected. He didn't have the best way of arguing. Like I say, the subtitle is Madman or Deist, or Madman and Deist. I'm sorry.
Right. Fair enough. So yeah, bit of a false dichotomy maybe. Okay, so let's start the ball rolling today properly with a little look at. Let me just add in. Here we go. A little look at the Lucan narrative. We'll get on to Matthew later and Herod. Just to give people a little bit of a reminder, the large problem with the nativity accounts is, well, there are only two nativity accounts. They only exist in Luke and Matthew, not in all of the Gospels, and not at all in the Pauline writing. So Paul mentions nothing about the nativity, the birth of Jesus. So this leads you to wonder whether actually this was just a later addition to the narrative, that Matthew added it and then Luke added it, but it seems that Luke doesn't really draw on Matthew's story at all. In fact, his story is so antithetical to Matthew that it's either a very robust statement against it in some way, or you could argue that it could be a later addition to Luke. And actually, I've written a piece on how Luke 1 and 2 are an interpolation. In fact, Raymond Brown, the great Catholic exegete, thought it was an interpolation, although he argued that it was Luke that added it later. So Luke's actual gospel appears to start at Luke 3. When you read from Luke 3 onwards, it's clearly the start of the gospel. Also, the Greek is slightly different in Luke 1 and 2 than it is in the rest of the gospel. And there are these lots of other arguments. And you said that you watched Bart Ehrman's webinar, and he agreed with this.
Yes. He revealed himself as even more of a heretic to fundamentalists when he also said that to him, there's a decent case that, Luke 1 and 2 were an add-on. And among the points he pointed out was that the earliest version of Luke, or something like Luke that's talked about, is the version from Marcion, which we can at least somewhat reconstruct because it's off-quoted by other sources like Tertullian when he's like attacking Marcion. And it seems like in Marcion's version, he's skipping chapters 1 and 2 completely. He's jumping right into chapter 3 with Jesus showing up at the baptism story. So that and a few other reasons he gave to suggest that, this might be an add-on. I don't remember if he said Luke added it on, or it was another person. I don't think he made a case on that webinar, not that I remember.
Yeah. Well, actually, here, if that comes up in a second, here is my piece on that, where I talk also about Marcion as well. The Luke 1 and 2 infancy narratives as a later interpolation. That's on my patheos.com blog, A Tippling Philosopher. You can go and find that. It's all there. Lots of interesting points there. I think, to me, it's pretty clearly an interpolation. The question is, as with Brown, was it Luke himself that wrote that later as an afterthought? And again, what would the reason for that be? Or was it other people, third parties, adding it on to Luke? And the fact that Marcion didn't have it, and that's one of the earliest copies of Luke that we have, then what explains that. But here are the claims. Now, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census to be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all the people were on their way to register for the census, each to his own city. Now Joseph went out up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was betrothed to him and was pregnant. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Okay, this is all a bit of a problem because there is no census that would require that. So we know that there was a census in 6 CE, and that census was the census under Quirinius, right? So this is known history, places that at 6 CE, and we know that Herod died, as we talked about in the discussion with Derek Lambert on Mythvision. We know that Herod died in 4 BCE or 5 BCE. Can I just interject with an awesome contribution. Thanks so much to Soup and Sandwich. Go Bucks. Hi, guys. Hello, and welcome to the conversation. Thank you so much, Soup and Sandwich. Really, really appreciated hugely. So we have these 2 dates, but it's not only the dates that are problematic. So Matthew doesn't work with Luke. Okay, so there is that problem. But Luke doesn't work with the claims he makes himself. So Luke is internally incoherent. So he makes a claim that that under in the time of Caesar Augustus, there was a census that was sort of requiring that everyone return to their own ancestral home for this census. Now, we know that the census of Quirinius was because they were taking over Judea as a province for the Roman Empire back from its client kingdom iteration. So a client kingdom was a buffer zone territory on the edge of the Roman Empire that had some degree of autonomy and that was never taxed by the Roman government directly. And so therefore, for Luke and Matthew to be consistent or coherent, mutually coherent, you would need Herod being in charge of a client kingdom, which we knew he was, to have had a Roman taxation, a direct Roman taxation under Quirinius. Now, we know that Quirinius wasn't governor until 6 CE, after the client kingdom stopped being a client kingdom, became a Roman province. Herod had been dead 10 years, and his son Herod Archelaus was ruling as tetrarch, and this census took place. But we also know that it was a census for Judea, not for Galilee. So Galilee was actually not part of this census, which is rather interesting in and of itself. So there are lots of problems with Luke's claim. Do you have anything to add at all on this so far?
Yeah, there's also the question of if Luke is even self-consistent in the events of things, because he mentions, for example, John the Baptist being born during the reign of Herod the king, and Jesus is supposed to be basically born only 6 months later. And of course, if he's talking Herod the Great, then there's no consistency with that. So Luke isn't even self-consistent. It is, I think, possible to try to force self-consistency into Luke if we think the Herod he's talking about is Herod Archelaus, and this is like right towards the end of his reign. But then he's even more in contradiction with Matthew, because it's very clear that the Herod that Jesus is born under is Herod the Great. So we could take 2 options. One, Luke is slightly consistent with Matthew, but completely self-inconsistent. Or he's self-consistent, but even more inconsistent with Matthew. But we can't have complete consistency across the board.
No, and so what Christian apologists tend to do is try and move Herod's death forward to the time of the census of Quirinius. We can't do that because Herod's death is really properly benchmarked. We talked about that in the other video. Check out the Myth Vision discussion about that. But that's really is benchmarked to 4 or 5 BCE. You can't get it any later than that. So the other option is to move Quirinius's governorship and census back to the time of Herod. But we know that Quirinius had a census in 6 CE. And we know that census was because Herod Archelaus had been ruling for 10 years and done such a bad job of ruling that the Romans took back control of the client kingdom into full province status. And so they needed to know what it was worth. So they ran a census in order to see how much tax income they could get, right? That's all pretty normal and it makes sense. That's all really coherent. So what do the Christians do in trying to move it back? Well, they look at how. So let's look at moving the census back to the time of Herod. And one of the common ways is to say that Quirinius ruled twice. But this is a really, really problematic apologetic, because there is absolutely no evidence in the history of the Roman Empire of a governorship, someone governing a province twice. So literally no one's done that. And they have to say, okay, this is what happens, even though there's no evidence either of Quirinius. So it's not a case of, it's not just a case of there's no governorship where this has happened, but they can also present no evidence that Quirinius ruled twice. Okay, so it's like this is just an apologetic to get them off the hook with no view as to how it might be evidenced.
And it's worth noting why it's the case that we've not seen any cases of anyone ruling a province twice. And really, it's the same sort of thing like any sort of like corporate or political structure. When you are getting a new position, you are trying to advance in your career. So going back to a previous state is basically to go back down in rank effectively. It would be like if to give a US-centric version of this, it'd be like if someone was a member of the House of Representatives, ran for president and became president, and then went back to being a House of Representatives member. It's like, no, you're stepping backwards, and you would have been remembered just for being that weirdo doing that. It would be so strange and unexpected. After you're president, no, you don't go back to being a House representative. No, you start your book tour. That's what you're doing after that point. So if someone was governor twice of Syria, it's like something terrible must have happened, and they effectively got demoted, but somehow not completely demoted, that they're still governing a rather important province. So it's just such wishy-washy thinking based on how much evidence. Desperation is the evidence.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say he's not remembered for this, because actually we have in Tacitus's Annals 348, the historian gives an obituary of Quirinius, and it's not mentioned anywhere. So someone's written his obituary talking about his life and doesn't mention that he ruled twice in any kind of capacity, whether governorship or some other capacity. In Syria. So it's simply ridiculous. Thank you to, is that Chindal or Chindi? Chindal, Chimbalu. Keep doing the great work. Thank you so much. It's really, really important, these contributions to allowing myself to do what I do. So really, really appreciate that. Thank you. In fact, I might keep it up there to show my extra appreciation. As I write in my own book, which is The Nativity, a Critical Examination, page 66, for Christians to hold such an improbable theory of double rulership, they must be able to bring something to the evidentiary table, or stand accused of inventing theories to fit conclusions with no basis whatsoever. And that reminds me of what the great Raymond Brown says, which is like the only reason you would try and do this is if you were trying to make Luke accurate. It's like there's no way of so this is what Raymond Brown says, page 554 of his own book, The Birth of the Messiah. He says, indeed, as regards the non-biblical evidence, it is doubtful that anyone would have even thought about an earlier census if he were not trying to defend Lucan accuracy. So the only reason you would try and do all these crazy apologetics is if you were so desperate in trying to make Luke cohere with Matthew and stay historically consistent, either internally or externally.
And you also have something else to ignore, because Josephus also tells us that when Herod died, he said who was the governor of Syria at that time, Quintus Varus, if memory serves, who, by the way, yes, is not Quirinius.
Yes. So actually, from various sources, we have a mapping out of all the governors. So when Marcus Titius ruled to about 10 to 9 BCE, then Gaius Sentius Saturninus from 10 to 9 to 7 to 6 BCE. And then after that, as you say, Varus ruling to about 4 BCE. So his coinage stops after the death of Herod. And we know that he ruled at the end of Herod's reign. So that's Varus and not Quirinius. And then we have a slight unknown from 4 to 1 BC, but it looks like it's probably Lucius Piso. And then from 1 BC to 4 CE, we've got Gaius Julius Caesar Vipsanianus. And then after that, Saturninus and then Quirinius. Coming along in 6. So the point being that we've got the records of all these governors. So what the Christians then do is if the skeptic comes back and says, right, you can't fit Quirinius in there, we've got Varus there at the time of Herod, right? And they say, okay, they either have to bury their head in their sand and say, no, that's wrong, and actually Quirinius was there, or they say there's a double governorship, so they were co-rulers. But the problem is saying this, so it's like Varus was ruling with Quirinius. The problem with saying this is that there's literally no evidence of a co-governorship of any province in the history of the Roman Empire. So again, it's like you are inventing stuff just to make your theory work, just to make Luke work.
Yeah, and it's just, you have to stop back and say to yourself, okay, how would that even work, like in a modern context? Again, I'm going to be US centric because of who I am, but if there were two governors of Massachusetts right now, how do you decide who does what and who has authority where? That, that's just causing massive confusion. And, nowhere in US history were there two people being governor at the same time, maybe except the Civil War. So that is just, a political mess that, just doesn't make any sense. And again, it's just absolutely, we're going to force this round peg into this triangular hole, not even a square peg or anything. No, this shape is completely off, and we're going to shave it till it's down to a tiny little thimble just to squeeze it in, because nothing else is going to make this work.
Yeah, and someone's just put in the comments there. My public has put in the comments. There's another common Christian apologetic, which is that actually Quirinius was military leader in the area at the time. So it wasn't that it was a double governorship, is that actually he was military leader. But the problem for this is he wasn't military leader in Syria. He was military leader in places around there, so Galatia. And this would be really weird to say that there was a census under Quirinius when it wasn't under Quirinius, because he wasn't the governor, and it was because he is military leader. Why would Luke say there was a census under Quirinius when he was a military leader in a slightly different geographical area than the area we're talking about, and he wasn't the governor? Surely you would say it was a census under whoever the governor was.
Yeah, unless we are going to suppose that it's the soldiers doing the census work, which is outside the normal procedures of what soldiers do. Soldiers, like what soldiers do in modern armies is pretty incredible, but census taking is not their normal job purview, especially the trigger pullers. And in the Roman army, basically everyone is a trigger puller or a ditch digger.
Yeah. And 72 to 73 in my own book, I answered this. So thanks, my public. That's a really good point to bring that up. A further proposal for the likes of Quirinius is that the verb used by Luke in reference to Quirinius's rule does not strictly mean to govern, but it is a more generalized understanding of command, thus invalidating the notion that the census took place whilst Quirinius was a governor of Syria. So this is what Christians say. He had... yes, so he had been in Asia Minor fighting a war from 6 BCE through to 1 BCE. In this way, apologists claim that the census could have taken place during a sort of military leadership of Quirinius before his actual governorship. This again has a series of problems. Firstly, Luke would not be referring to this kind of leadership to signpost when a census was held. Why would he want to signpost a census in Syria by referring to the military leader of the Roman army in Asia? The clear and obvious choice would be the governor himself. Moreover, fighting skirmishes in nearby Galatia and Cilicia does not imply a command of anything in Syria. Galatia is its own province and is obviously not Syria. In geographical terms, the army fighting there would have to come from the north in Galatia and not Syria. In order for this claim to hold, a large stretch of plausibility and a dollop of generosity in reading Luke would have to be afforded. It doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. Yeah. But this is a sort of... apologetic that we're really used to, and you've had a lot of experience with this as well, because as we'll come on to, and I'll quote from my book to tee this up for you, there's a chap called Ernest Martin who does a lot of this. So Ernest Martin, as I wrote, page 71, is some Christians are proponents of the theory that Quirinius ruled at some other point in time in a dual rule with someone else. So this is what we mentioned a little while back. Essentially, this problem falls into the same trap as a claim that he ruled twice separately, in that it is unprecedented in Roman history. Ernest L. Martin implores that, quote, there was no consistent system yet worked out for the governorships of these provinces. That's what he claims, right? There's no consistent kind of history of rulership. However, in direct opposition to this point, Carrier replies in 2011 that, quote, this is argued with no evidence whatsoever, and it is flatly contradicted by the evidence that we do have. Right. And this is so common. It's Christian apologists say this is how it could have happened. And it could be that actually Roman rulership was different and we have no consistent history for Roman rulership. And in this case, Carrier comes back and says, we do have consistent history and you are presenting no positive evidence for your position. Would you agree that Ernest L. Martin is not being very objective with his history here?
I would agree. With one correction, I would say he was not. Martin died a little more than 10
Oh,
years
sorry.
ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, and also for our audience to know, because Ernest Martin is not a household name. He was originally a student, like a PhD candidate studying meteorology, and then basically really found religion and basically went full on in doing biblical studies. He was entranced in particular by Herbert Armstrong, the person who founded the Worldwide Church of God, one of the early televangelists, basically, first through radio and later through other sources. So like that's kind of his history. He is or was not a professional accredited biblical scholar, and came kind of like me from more of a science background, but also ultimately believing in the infallibility of the Bible, and various other beliefs that were also a little bit particular to his religious group.
Can I throw something in there? Because when you and I spoke with Derek Lambert on Myth Vision, the reason I want to throw this in is it's completely pertinent to Ernest Martin. This is a quote from the YouTube comment, and I know YouTube comments are whatever in many experiences, but here this person says, you cannot be recommending a book by a physicist. This is you, Dr. Aaron Adair, writing on the Star of Bethlehem. As a physicist, you can know nothing about this. So you cannot be recommending a book by a physicist with no expertise in interpreting what the text actually claims, something for which there is no scholarly consensus, which is interesting because he's almost undoing his own argument there. I will recommend Ernest L. Martin's book that gives what, in my view, is a correct interpretation of what the Magi observed. And I came back to this. Are you serious? So he's saying you can't use Dr. Aaron Adair's book to talk about the interpretation of the Star of David. You should be using Ernest L. Martin's book. And I said, Martin is an evangelical weather forecaster. His theories have been roundly debunked. And then he goes off to try and excuse what he said or whatever. But yeah. I think that should tee you up nicely for who is Ernest L. Martin, which you've said he's basically a not finished PhD meteorologist, weather forecaster, or studying weather, and then he got into Christianity and then wrote a book which is actually quite a big book in your niche area on the Star of Bethlehem.
Yeah, it's also kind of like the foundational text for what has been also popular in a lot of evangelical circles when they've been discussing the Star of Bethlehem. So, for example, there was the very popular Star of Bethlehem documentary that came out, I think, 2008. And when I say very popular, it shot up to #1 in documentaries being sold on Amazon. It's been featured on various evangelical television programs. The document itself was also produced by the same producer who made Braveheart and The Last Temptation of Christ. So it's got some smart film people behind it in creating it in the first place. And from what I can tell, when I listen to other Christians who are into this, they're really enthralled by it, because it seems like we're going to come along and we're going to fix the problems that people think they see with the census, with the death of Herod, with the Star of Bethlehem. They'll even also try to bring in Revelation 12 to explain what's going on. So literally the visions of John the, not John the Evangelist, but John of Patmos, and, all of his, honestly strange visions as read literally, and trying to bring that all in to say, and here's what's actually happening in the sky. And we're going to date this down to the very day that Jesus was born. And hallelujah, all the things fit together, but it doesn't.
Yeah, so I mean, he really sort of tries to play around with chronology there, doesn't he, Ernest L. Martin? Oh, yeah. And it's this appeal to what could happen conceptually. I've talked about this with you before, and Derek plays that video of
Dumb and Dumber.
Yeah, from Jim Carrey from Dumb and Dumber, saying, so there's a chance. It's this appeal. Possibility ergo probability. Well, if it could conceptually happen, then that's what happened. And this is Ernest L. Martin's kind of approach, and other people I've argued with personally, like Lydia McGrew, which is to say, here's what might explain this incongruity, right? Well, you could conceive of a scenario where this might happen, but I'm not going to present any evidence for this happening, and I'm not going to even express how it's the most probable explanation of the data. Which is what really I should do in order to convince you that you should believe my thesis, because surely we should believe that which is the most probable explanation of any given data.
and his interpretations are sometimes forced to try to be strange to fit his thing. So the thing he spends the most amount in his books is trying to move the date of Herod's death. In particular, he's going to try to argue that Herod died in early 1 BCE, which is 3 years later than what most historians are going to say, because most will say he died in early 4 BCE. And they say that because there's actually good reasons to. Now, what Martin usually does, like his main argument against this, is that the lunar eclipse that's mentioned by Josephus that took place before he died, there isn't enough time between that lunar eclipse, Herod to die, all the stuff that his will was supposed to have been transpired done, and the Passover that Josephus mentions. There's this relatively short time window that everything needs to be done. So Martin is going to say, well, let's just say, how long does it take to do this task as described by Josephus, or this task, add up the days and say, well, there's no way we can fit it in that time frame. But the problem is that some of his interpretations are super strained. Like, how long did Herod's funeral last? And he's going to make it last weeks. To take Herod's body from Jerusalem to his burial place at the Herodium, which is not too far away from Bethlehem. And he has this strained reading saying that the people taking it there were only allowed to go several hundred yards a day and then have to stop, and apparently just sit there for the other 20 hours of time that apparently they're only allowed to walk just a few hundred yards a day and have to stop. And everyone else is like, no, that's not what the Greek means. And Martin's comeback is, well, this is what Herod would have wanted. He's got to be grandiose. And it's just like, all he can do is basically complain about that.
And it's just presenting an idea of what might happen rather than saying, this is what happened because actually I've seen this in the evidence. It's like, this must be true. How can I make it true? And then I go backwards from this supposed truth, and I just present something that seems conceptually plausible, but that has no positive evidence.
Yeah. And when it comes to, if you're going to choose things, you need to be weighing probabilities. You need to be weighing possible explanations. So here's one. So maybe if we're going to say Josephus is wrong about the year and be off by 3 years, which is a pretty major mistake, well, what other options could we say could be the case as well? So if Martin is right, there isn't enough time between the eclipse and the Passover, then maybe we'll say, maybe Josephus fudged on the eclipse for dramatic effect because he has the eclipse happening at a very dramatic point in time. People do that, and that is not an absurd thing to suggest. And if the difference is Josephus fudged the date of the eclipse versus he screwed up by 3 years in his chronology, well, those two, moving the eclipse is a little bit different. On the other hand, there's an earlier eclipse that happened in late 5 BC that then has none of the temporal problems that Martin brings up. And the only thing Martin can do to say to that is Yeah. It's basically all the response I have seen since then. Is just like, it couldn't have been that one. No. It's like, it fits in some ways. I actually think the late 5 BCE total lunar eclipse then actually fits the data better. There's also this other piece of evidence that Martin doesn't bring up at all. It's called the Scroll of Fasting. And it has all these dates in fasting. And there's a couple of dates in there that aren't explained. And most scholars think, oh, this date right here, this is probably the death day of Herod. And if you look at that date, the only place it would be consistent with everything else from Josephus' account would be in late 5 BCE, just basically maybe a few weeks after the late 5 BCE lunar eclipse. In other words, if we look at all the evidence, it super fits this time very, very well. How does it fit this other time? If you complain and hem and haw a lot, and that's all you can do.
So what we have is the received idea that Herod died in 4 to 5 BCE, right? So taking Josephus at his word, but also if like you said, if Josephus is wrong by 3 years, it's not just the problem with saying this, and I don't think Christians necessarily get this all the time, or at least they ignore this, is if you take this one date and this one thing happening, which is Herod dying, and say, okay, he got that wrong by 3 years, and we're going to take that there and put it there. It's not this one little fact in isolation that you can just extract from there and put there, because what this does is this actually maps onto everything that happens around it. But also we know that Josephus says, well, he ruled for this long, he was born here, or he was born here, he started his rulership here, this happened, this was by the eclipse, this happened here, Varus was ruling at the time, blah 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 blah, right? There's actually a whole load of things which is also externally validated by people like Cassius Dio, by records and all of this that kind of carry on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
in particular, like when Josephus mentions, like saying, in this particular year of Herod's reign, he visited Augustus when Augustus was visiting Asia Minor. We know that, so according to the standard view, this would be 20 BCE. And we can look at, for example, the writings of Caesar Augustus himself, along with other historians, and say, yeah, and I was visiting this place at 20 BC. So it lines up perfectly.
Yes.
If we shift things 3 years, we don't, we don't fix one problem, we make 10.
Yeah. Exactly. So you can't just go, I'm extracting this one datum and I'm putting it here, because actually it's like the thread, it all, if everything's interconnected, it all falls apart. You take out that keystone, everything is a keystone, because there's a matrix of fact, or
Yeah.
like what we understand as fact, because it interlocks with all these other external bits of data, as well as with Josephus's own entire mosaic of history, and you just can't do that. You can't do it.
Right. Yeah, and it's also worth noting that, because Herod ultimately has power because of his relationship with the Romans, and when the various major figures in the Roman Empire are doing their things, those are well dated. So in particular, Herod became king of the Jews by a decree of the Senate, and the Senate was basically pushed because Herod became buddy-buddy with Mark Antony. And Mark Antony was in Rome at that time to basically help Herod get control. So if we shifted that 3 years, the problem is we know where Mark Antony was that time. He wasn't in Rome. He was literally in Parthia trying an invasion at that time. So again, if we try shifting things, we have to basically rewrite the end of the Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire. And if we're all doing this to try to maybe fix a census story in an attached edition to Luke, we stopped doing history, didn't we?
Oh man, I just got a shiver down my spine. I love that, Aaron, because this is the world of a skeptic, right? Which is like, okay, it's all about making things coherent and cogent and cohesive, and all those other words. It's just, and this all works. And if you as an apologist have to get these two, Matthew and Luke, to be both historically factual, right? We say you just can't do it. But in order to do that, if you think you can do this one thing and change that, you have to realize that you are basically changing the entire history of the Roman Empire just by trying to move Herod's death from here to there, or Quirinius's census from here to there. It's just, I don't think Christians realize how insurmountable that hill is. I don't know. But
well,
can
of
I
course,
just
everything written by Tacitus and Suetonius, and that was actually all written by Satan. So that's why it's all fake news.
There you go. Just can't win that one. So can I just say thank you to my public? That's so generous. A $10 contribution. That's brilliant. I don't know what book he says is great. It's one of these two, but I'll take both. Actually, they're both great. So thank you.
I'll consider your to be the plural you.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. Very good. I like what you've done. So here's a question from Satan. What I like that, Satan. Was a census just a head count, or did they gather other info such as property ownership? Well, actually, the census for taxation purposes would have been property ownership. And this is why Luke is so wrong. So if we go back to sharing, Luke's census claim again, where are we? We're here. Hopefully you can see that. Now, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census to be taken of all the inhabited earth. Now, let's talk about this for a short while. All the inhabited earth is a huge problem because there is no census that has ever been done of the whole Roman Empire. You'd get census of Roman citizens, then you get censuses of some provinces. You wouldn't get censuses of client kingdoms. And so even that claim is a real problem. I mean, you could be generous and say Luke is using a sort of figurative term. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yes, and it's also worth noting that the story of Joseph needing to come from the Galilee to Bethlehem for this registration, for this census, wouldn't have included Galilee as well, because, again, what we actually know about the Quirinius census is that it was about the kingdom of Archelaus being absorbed into the Syrian province. That did not include Galilee. So there is no reason for Joseph to have been registering there in the first place, because he was in a different place. It would have been, again, frankly, it would have been like me living in Canada, but then I have to register for the US Census. What? No.
Yeah, exactly. And what is Raymond Brown says something of this. So some Christians will say, well, actually, what he means by the whole world is actually just the whole land of Palestine, and it's just a turn of phrase. The problem is, so as Raymond Brown says on page 395 of The Birth of the Messiah, it is one of his appendices, the suggestion of a hypothetical Hebrew original which had the whole land of Palestine, quotes, is weak, since Luke uses gay and not oikumene for that expression in Luke 4:25. In other words, in other places where he means the whole land of Palestine, he uses a different Greek term. So in order to try and claim this is this is what Luke is doing, you are Luke disagrees with you. You just can't do that. So what Raymond Brown says about the rest of this, the whole world usage, is the Greek oikumene means the orbis terrarum, the civilized world of which the Roman emperor was lord. See the similar Lucan usage in Acts 11:28. But since we know of no single census of the whole empire under Augustus, some would argue that Luke meant only the provinces. So what Brown is saying here is that actually you really can't get out the fact that Luke is just being wrong. Like, if he means all of the provinces, then there is no census of all the provinces. If you mean all of the Roman Empire, there's no census of all the Roman Empire. There's nothing that makes sense of this. So this is either Luke being very superlative and exaggerative, or it's just Luke being wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. So either it's super local and it shouldn't have involved the Holy Family, or it's the whole Roman Empire, and then it's a big mystery that it is never mentioned by anyone at all.
Yeah, exactly. So then we move on to the next point of contention. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, there's lots of ink that's been spilt on this, and I think in the questions here, another argument says my public. Another argument is Luke said this was the first registration. This was not a census, but a registration before the census. There are two things that Christians try here. One is this is an oath-making census. It's not really a census. It's this making an oath to which there is some evidence this has happened elsewhere, that you had to make some public oath to the emperor. But if this is the case, like, there's again no evidence of this in Syria at the time under Quirinius, and again you would not need to go to an ancestral home to do this, which is what Luke then says. You would go there's a really big problem with Luke's claim that you have to go to an ancestral home for a Roman tax census. That there is absolutely no evidence. It's highly unlikely that would ever be the case. But it's even less likely, that you would do that for an oath-making ceremony, right? Go from Galilee down to Bethlehem in order to say, yeah, I really like Caesar Augustus. He's awesome, and then go back again.
Exactly. It would be like somehow in modern times, I had to return from where I am here in the U.S. to go to where my ancestors were 1,000 years ago. So maybe I have to go to Essex so I can say "God save the Queen" and then go home.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, why? It's just absolute nonsense. And then who's paying for this? Who would, people aren't going to be working for all this time. It's just crazy. So I think the oath making claim is really problematic. But the other one is that it's just the first census, that there were two. So so Christians claim could be that there's a census that's happened beforehand at a previous time, and actually the one in 6 CE was the second census under Quirinius. Okay, but the problem is, again, there's no positive evidence for this, and it's all about the translation of what first means. So there's lots of arguments over what first means. Raymond Brown, again on page 395, would say Greek syntax and textual variants, e.g. with an article, permit other translations. And he says there are lots of translations that Christians try to get this to fit. But it seems like this is the first census, i.e. not the first census under Quirinius, as in Quirinius's first census, but the first census of the area as a whole, because it's just become a province after being a client kingdom and has never had a census before. And this is the first census it was ever to have, full stop. Not the first Quirinius census, inferring that there are more than one Quirinius census.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that we have reason to believe there wouldn't have been a prior census in the first place, because we see what happened to the reaction of the Quirinius census. It led to the first major revolts against the Romans. So if the Romans were already performing censuses and direct taxation decades earlier, then it leaves as weird why all of a sudden in 6 CE, the second round or the third round or whatever of censusing is now all of a sudden getting people up in arms. It's usually, the first time, the first indignation that, gets people upset, and to start with, I think it was Judas the Galilean, who then is said like to start the Zealot movement. Again, if all of this had happened a decade earlier, then it really is a very strange thing that only 10 years later did somebody decide to start getting upset about it.
Yeah, you would. So, really good point, because if you'd had under Herod a Roman tax census in order to make Roman taxes on property in a client kingdom, you can bet your bottom dollar everyone would have gone mental. And actually, Herod probably would have been dead against this. This is like, I pay a tribute to Rome. That's what client kingdoms do. But don't come to my kingdom and start making censuses for taxation purposes. This is my area, and I'm not going to like that. So Herod would be having,
in fact, is quite the opposite. If anything, what we actually see in the life of Herod, it's not that his control over his own land is being taken away. He was actually given the ability to be basically the financial administrator for Syria. He was basically so good at extracting wealth from his own country. They let him handle the wealth extraction and things like that from another province. It was because Herod was so good at this sort of thing that some might even say he was great at it. The reason Herod got that moniker is because of all the major building projects. Well, how do you do all those major building projects? You need cash, money. And guess what? Herod was very good at doing that. So why would the Romans come in and screw up a good thing? Especially if they were just saying, hey, you're doing such a good job, we're going to give you even more responsibilities because you're ruling this eastern province so darn well. If I could also expand upon this, so, I mean, not only do we have Herod's burial sites, like his work at Masada, the second temple that he basically rebuilt, it also looks like his construction crews were elsewhere. So in modern day Lebanon, there's a rather famous temple that's usually called either at Heliopolis or Baalbek. Some people go there, think it was built by ancient aliens or Atlanteans or things like that. But we actually can, date it. And it looks like the crews that might have worked on it might have actually been from Herod, from Herod's construction companies. So this is the level of financing he's doing. He's actually helping even finance and build up temples in other parts of the East because he's just so damn good at getting money for these projects.
Brilliant. Can I just say thank you to Justice Rocha with 350 South African Rand, I do believe, if my currency knowledge is correct. Thank you very much from all the way down in South Africa. That's brilliant. I really, really appreciate that. And thank you so much to Sky Daddy Mythbusters, $25. What a legend. A ledge burger with extra relish. Hoping for a new year with more of these skeptical takedowns of old superstitions and hearsay. This is what we're here for. We are providing a service to humanity, and there's no better service than debunking the nativity claims. It's one of those. It's one of the things that gives me joy in life, as well as spending time with Dr. Aaron Adair, who's awesome. Thank you very much, Sky Daddy Mythbusters. So generous. And here we have Vaguely Agnostic coming in with a really generous $10. Thank you. Really kind. So question here, Dr. Adair, what are the theories on where the Magi were actually from? Was astrology studied by Israelis? And what royalties existed in the late 1st and 2nd century? And this is actually something we're going to come on to anyway. So that's brilliant. Thank you for that. You've segued us on moving from Luke and Luke's narrative of the census. Hopefully we can put the census to bed. We won't talk about the ancestral having to go to your ancestral home. It's just clearly nonsense, and maybe I'll do a whole other video on that. But now we'll move towards Matthew and what Matthew says of Herod. Over to you, Dr. Adair.
All right, so vaguely agnostic, let's see if we can get you to certainly agnostic by the end of this program. I kid. All right. So, where did the Magi come from? So the terminology initially looks very vague, that they said they're just come from the East. Well, East is a pretty, wide possibility space. I mean, are we talking all the way east as far as Japan or China? I mean, it fits that wording, but because we are specifically called, they are called the Magi or the Magoi in the Greek, and we're saying they are specifically from the East. This sounds like we are more talking about members of the Zoroastrian priesthood. It gets a little bit confusing because the word Magoi on its own at this time had kind of changed its original meaning, where originally the word itself derives from Persian to refer to the caste of the priests, but eventually the Greeks would use the word and it would actually replace their older word for wizards or magic people. So, for example, there is a magus that Peter deals with. There's another magus that Paul deals with, but they're not in the East, but they're seeming to do magic stuff. So, like, for example, Simon Magus, who basically, tries buying the Holy Spirit from St. Peter, according to the book of Acts. There's another magician in Cyprus, if I remember correctly, that Paul deals with. And that was a Elymaeus Bar Jesus, if I'm remembering correctly. So those guys seem to be, straight up magic users. But they're not, called Eastern Magi. By saying that they're Eastern, we probably want to look towards the East. Now, the possibilities that you would find in the church fathers, like the first several centuries, the three that come up the most are either they come from Babylon or more broadly Babylonia, they come from various Persian provinces, or they come from Arabia. The one about Arabia is a little bit weird because if you look at a map, Arabia is not east of the Holy Land. At least you wouldn't think so, especially if you're thinking like Saudi Arabia. That's definitely not east. So why are any church fathers saying that? It actually goes back to our earliest church father, Justin Martyr, discussing this. But when Justin Martyr tries explaining how he knows that, he doesn't say, well, I got it from this source, or I heard it from this person, or I got it from this other gospel. He says, okay, I'm going back to the Old Testament and I'm interpreting these verses as that are actually about demons and demon possessions. These are the people that Jesus is fighting. And I think the Magi were actually throwing off demonhood to come to Jesus. Therefore, because this is about Damascus, and Damascus is a code word for demon possession, and Damascus was originally a part of Arabia at one time. Therefore, the Magi are Arabian. And if you notice how convoluted that logic is, and none of it relates to historical sourcing, you can see that if that's the Arabian tradition, it's completely forced. And no one ever really referred to Arabia as the East with respect to there. So more likely Babylonia or Persia. And can we be more specific than that? Again, if it's supposed to be the Zoroastrian priesthood, they would more likely be in like the major Persian cities like Ctesiphon, for example. But again, there's plenty of vagary there. Onto the point of astrology amongst Israelis or Jews. So it's actually a bit complicated because we can tell that there was interest in astrology, there was knowledge of astrology, but there was also condemnations of it as well. So it's rather confusing and convoluted. You go to the Talmud, and you can see the rabbis are familiar with applying astrological reasoning to medicine, for example. On the other hand, they say astrology shouldn't be applied. It doesn't actually affect Jewish people, or it doesn't affect Israel. It's a separate phenomenon that only affects Gentiles. So there's that sort of infighting. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, on the other hand, we actually have like fragments of them doing horoscopic astrology, or saying, well, because of the positions of the planets or thunder in this direction, it would have this effects on the body and character of people. So they were definitely doing astrology in the Dead Sea sect, at least to some degree. So it's a convoluted mess. They were certainly aware of astrology and astrological thinking. To what degree they applied and what astrology they used is much harder. Much harder to tell. That's a bit of a mess.
Nice, thank you. Great question there. And this is from Soup and Sandwich again. What a very generous human being. I've listened to you two for the last several days, at least once a day. Just wonderful. Thank you. Brilliant. I love that, because I am, the way I read that comment, and this is my overt narcissism, Aaron, is that on Christmas Day, Soup and Sandwich is saying, no, I'm not having my meal. You can send that turkey straight back. I've got some listening to do. I've got some skepticism to have.
I appreciate that, but I have trouble listening to my own voice. So if it's coming to watching myself versus watching the new Matrix movie, it's no competition.
I think you sound wonderful and erudite and full of great sense, Aaron. So thank you for that. So talking about the star and Herod, I think there's an interesting. I'd like your opinion on this. This is going back to D.F. Strauss and what D.F. Strauss says all the way back, hundreds of years ago, or at least over 100 years ago. Talking about or it's between 100 and 200 years ago. So talking about how Herod asks for the position of the star, or asks. So actually, should we go back and look at what Matthew says, just so we can go back to the source material as accurately as possible?
Yes, we'll go back to the source, but we'll then question what his source was.
Yes, quite. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." So this is where you get this idea of, have they lost the star? Why have they come to Jerusalem? Why has the star led them to Jerusalem? It only makes sense if you are an author trying to get Herod involved in the story, and the Magi are a literary mechanism to get Herod involved, because he wants Herod to be the new Pharaoh and Jesus to be the new Moses. That's what I would say. Would you agree broadly with that?
I do. In my book, there is something I tried to be a bit careful on, where the text doesn't literally say that the star led them to Jerusalem and disappeared. Because it doesn't literally say that, I didn't make that a premise in any of my arguments. But it is an extremely natural deduction to make from the story, and it is what the vast majority of the early church fathers and extra biblical gospels would do as well, where there is a leading star that basically gets them from the east to Jerusalem, takes off for a bit, reappears, and then points to the final location.
Yeah, because if they were following that star consistently, then they wouldn't go to Jerusalem. I mean, that's the point. If you're coming from the east, you would just have you'd go straight to Bethlehem, right? So Bethlehem's just south of Jerusalem. You would go straight to Bethlehem. You wouldn't go to Jerusalem. The only reason you go to Jerusalem is if the star led you to Jerusalem and then kind of disappeared, which would lead you to go, does anyone know where this new thing is? So
at the very least coming in and asking, so where's this Messiah guy? We're a bit lost. If they had believed that this was like, another son of Herod or something, they would have just gone directly to his castle, or spoke directly to his entourage, not coming to the city. He's like, "Hey, anyone see a new Jewish king?"
So
and when I say that, like shouting that out, because the gospel does say that Herod was disturbed and all of Jerusalem with him. So this was not a private little matter. Literally, the whole city was like, making a mess in their pants.
Yes. So exactly. So where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was and all Jerusalem with him. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. I find this fascinating, right? Because surely all people should know where the Messiah was to be born. Like, if this was common knowledge, like this should be, everyone should know, the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. And if everyone knows this, you'd all be moving to Bethlehem so you can try and pop out your child in Bethlehem, right? In the hope that, come on, my kid's going to be the Messiah. Like, I don't understand this whole, I do understand it because it's just a kind of story that's been cobbled together by Matthew to try and get Jesus born in Bethlehem and Herod involved, right? But when you really read this literally, it makes very little sense. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, and it's also worth noting. Like, I tried, searching to see what other sources were, looking to the Old Testament to try to predict where the Messiah would be. And when I tried, like, tracing every source that has been suggested for that, like, here's this Talmudic author talking about this, that, or the other thing, and I realized the actual result is nobody was thinking this at the time. This was an invention, as far as I can tell, by Matthew.
Yeah. So, and gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. Like, he wouldn't have thought of that earlier. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for from you will come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And this is where people like D.F. Strauss again have said, actually, this is an incorrect reading of that that quote. It doesn't mean that the Messiah should be born in Bethlehem as a geographical prophecy, but that he should come from the house of Bethlehem, from the Davidic line. So actually, you can be born anywhere, but you need to be a Bethlehemite. So this could be that Matthew is just misreading and misappropriating that so-called prophecy. Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. Now, this is the point I want to come to. This is what D.F. Strauss is saying, is that he is oddly asking them to triangulate. He's doing some kind of triangulation, but he's now asking them where the Star of Bethlehem is, for some reason as yet unknown. And this is a little bit weird. So he secretly called for the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him. After hearing the king, they went away and behold the star. So they went and found Jesus. And then after that, they had a dream sequence where they go back a separate way. Because God warns them. When we talked about this in previous, why did God not warn them before they went to Jerusalem? So this is God being weird and saying, actually, we're only going to warn you after, which means I definitely want Herod involved, and Herod kills a bunch of innocent children, so I definitely want innocent children to die. Therefore, the birth of Jesus necessarily causes the death of innocent children. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And yeah, it definitely seems like when God wants to, he'll send messages, because in Matthew's gospel that the people who get messages are Joseph, the Magi, and later on, Pilate's wife. We sometimes forget that as well, but she also gets a message in a dream to basically say, hey, be careful with this person. He's especially elected. So it seems like things are going to go the way God wants them to, and he's going to tell people what he wants them to do, and otherwise let things play out. So he clearly planned out the death of innocent babies for the purpose of fulfilling a prophecy that he himself invented.
And it's always interesting when Matthew, writing in 85 odd CE, decades and decades after the death of Jesus, seems to know what was in people's minds when they're having a dream. It's odd. Pilate's wife, you seem to know what's going on there. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and the same sort of way when all the disciples are asleep and Jesus is praying, and somehow the omniscient narrator knows all, even though all the disciples are, snoozing.
This is what someone's just said in the comments, which is exactly what I just said, which is how does the author know who got what message and what the message was? So I always say, whenever there is speech in the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, Hebrew Bible or Christian Bible or whatever, whenever you see speech there, that should ring alarm bells, because no history book reports speech in pre-recorded times, right? As in like video audio recording, or much better written recording. So speech is not something that you associate with decent history, yet the Bible is chock full of speech. That should ring alarm bells.
Yeah, there weren't, stenographers running around everywhere to record the dot and tittle of every random person. And it's also worth noting, all the times where Jesus is alone, like when he's in the desert fighting with Satan for 40 days. Yeah, who's around there to record that? If we had a reporter from the New York Times, going and reporting that, at the very least, they'd say, okay, so what's your second source on that?
Yeah, exactly. So that is completely bonkers. So going back to Matthew, the escape to Egypt. Now that they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Warns Joseph. Joseph hops off to Egypt with his family. And then Herod. So I'm going to just run down to Herod slaughters babies. So then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent men and killed all the boys who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity, who were 2 years old or under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Right. It's this point. So it's a point that right back here, he determines the time of where, determines the place of where the star is. And then much later on, he then goes and kills babies based on that exact location from that triangulation of the star, right? Mm-hmm. And this is what D.H. Strauss says. Well, this is a little bit weird. So D.H. Strauss says, but all the way back in 1860, but this plan of murdering all the children of Bethlehem up to a certain age was not conceived by Herod until after the Magi had disappointed his expectation that they would return to Jerusalem, a deception which, if we may judge from his violent anger on account of it, Herod had by no means anticipated. Prior to this, so if he hadn't anticipated this, why is he already triangulating the date, which he would only do if they wouldn't come back to him? And he wanted to know where Jesus was born had they not come back to him. So prior to this, it had been his intention to obtain from the Magi on their return so great a description of the child, his dwelling and circumstances, that it would be easy for him to remove this infantine rival without sacrificing any other life. So this is really bizarre behavior from Herod. And he points out that this is not what someone would actually do, but this is what someone who's writing a story that's trying to contrive Herod getting involved and having this kind of deus machina sort of machinations to allow him to do that.
One small correction. You said that the date for Strauss's book there is 1860. I think that's specifically that English translation of the 4th edition. The first edition is from 1835 in the original German.
So this is 1860 in my book, but I haven't checked what my bibliography to exactly which edition that was. So you're quite right. I would have to go back to my bibliography and note that was indeed.
I'm just being pedantic, but
no, and I love that.
That's for the sorts of pedantry.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. And the other thing I want to bring up about Herod is this, and you know quite a bit about Herod, so I'd be interested in your opinion here. But Herod is apparently so angry that there is this upstart king that is being born, right? But at the time, we know that Herod was very ill. And in fact, we also know he was suicidal. And we also know he didn't leave his kingdom in any fit state. Like, he didn't work out who was going to rule the kingdom after he died. So he had no forethought as to what was going to go on with the kingdom of Judea from the point of his death onwards, right? So why would he be so intent on killing a newborn child who would, the problem of which would only come to fruition in 20 years down the line? Why there seems to be no sense to his actions here, given what we know about him, the fact that he was very ill, suicidal, basically wasn't too interested in forward planning, was very interested in the here and now. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So a few things come to mind. So that, at this point of Herod's life, I mean, he is, in a really nasty state. According to Josephus, that he literally had like worms coming out of his genitals and things like that, and that'll drive anyone insane. He was in a really nasty state. He was about 70 years old, rough stuff. And even before that, he had been showing his great paranoia. He had killed several of his children, his wife, out of paranoia, thinking that they were plotting after him. Some of the plots might have been more real than others, but nonetheless, he's going around and being, constantly paranoid. So there is this kind of a weird thing that, he doesn't have like a great plan for what's going to happen after he dies. But he also then cares that he's being usurped. But he also trusts the people who are coming to usurp him. It's definitely not a consistent storyline, even just throughout chapter 2. If he is supposed to be the great murderer who is trying to, connive and plan things out, but also completely trusting of the people who are literally coming in to say, there's a new king in town, who isn't you, by the way. And again, this is something I mentioned in the Myth Vision podcast. The Magi, again, they're coming from Persia, and Herod had to personally fight the Persians to become king of Judea. And he also thought the Persians were actually working to poison him. He, back in 8 BC, he killed his son because in torturing various people, he had heard of a plot that they were going to poison him, and it was involving the Persian king. So if literal members of the Persian government, what the Magi would be, they'd be coming in saying, you're not the king. Oh, by the way, we're the Persian Magi. By the way, how's that poison tasting? That's what would be going through his mind if he's going to be doing this. Like, he has no reason to just trust that they're just going to come back. So either he doesn't give a hoot and just doesn't involve him at all, or he's the very paranoid man that we usually see him as. And either the Magi are going to be stopped permanently by being either in prison or executed, or we're going to expect a series of spies coming along with them, so that way the moment they find the right place, there's a dead Jesus.
Yeah, and I think I know Christians try and defend this by saying actually the slaughter of the innocents would only have been half a dozen babies, and you get these kind of arguments as to really how many people are involved in this supposed slaughter, but for me, given the whole problem with God providing a warning dream only after they had got Herod involved, means that if it's one child, that's one child too many. Like Jesus' birth necessitates the death of one child. God seems to want these children to die in order for, I don't know why, because it's not clear why these children have to die. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. Other than
they have to die because God said so.
Well, other than to make Herod look like the new Pharaoh, which makes Jesus look like the new Moses, because he then gets chased to Egypt and then waits. So the idea is that he waits for, or the family wait for at least 2 years, because you need Herod to die first, you need Archelaus to take over, and you need the Joseph and Mary and son to realize it's safe to then come back and decide to settle up in Nazareth. So it seems like a 2 years is generally what people accept as a sojourn in Egypt, which doesn't
also when it comes to that, it's also, I think, worth noting something else that we didn't bring up in the podcast for the last time. So they run away from Bethlehem because they're trying to escape Herod. They don't go back to Bethlehem because of Herod Archelaus. Then why did they go to Galilee that's being run by another Herod? They could have stayed in this place called Egypt. Like if they went to Alexandria, it's like, oh, there's a great Jewish population here. We can get some work done to make some money, or we can sell off all these, nice trinkets we just got from the Magi. How about we stay here where it's not being run by madmen?
Yeah, so it's Herod Antipas that's ruling Galilee and area. So
yeah, who eventually also is part of Jesus' execution as well, according to the Gospel of Luke. So it's like they're not escaping any danger by going to Galilee. It's like, okay, how about you stick in the country you ran off to? It seems like if you could stay there and you have the finances to, again, according to the story, move into a decent district in Alexandria. There's a Jewish population there. Say hi to nice people like Philo of Alexandria. I'm pretty sure they'd help you settle in. Boom, problem solved.
Oops, I've just accidentally added that. So do you want to talk a little bit, because I've just got to shoot off for a second. Do you want to just talk a little bit about Revelations 12 and how that pertains to Herod at all? Is that
all right? Gotcha on that. Yeah. Oh, you kicked me off.
No, I don't want. I want to remove myself.
All right. So this relates back to some things we mentioned with Ernest Martin. So in his efforts to try to explain the Star of Bethlehem story, he first off, of course, has to move the death of King Herod, because he's going to look in particular at conjunctions of planets taking place in 3 and then 2 BCE. These are supposed to be conjunctions between the planets Jupiter and Venus, and also taking place in the constellation Leo around the star Regulus. Thinking like, hey, here's the planet king, the planet king with Jupiter around the lion, which is kind of regal, around Regulus, the king star, king, claimed all that's there. Among the arguments that Martin will also make is that he sees the story being told in Revelation 12. So I don't have control to bring up Revelation 12, but if you do in your own Bibles, you will see this very strange vision where it says, behold, in the heavens, a woman in the clothed with the sun, standing at the moon, with a crown of 12 stars, heavily pregnant, and we're having birth pangs, is about to give birth, and also a sign in heaven that they see a giant red dragon wanting to consume the son that's about to be given birth to. And then the son is born, but is then taken up to God. Then there is the great war in heaven, where then the dragon is thrown down to the world. This all sounds, like pretty crazy, heady stuff. What Martin will do, looking at the story of a woman giving birth in heaven, being chased by a dragon, etc., this is supposed to be the Herod story. And the events being told is actually giving us a very specific date by saying the woman in the sky is the constellation Virgo, the Virgin, and therefore when that the constellation, and here's the sun, we're saying the moon and the sun are in the constellation Virgo, And this is also supposed to be taking place with the various conjunctions of the planets that Martin says are important. And so Martin is going to say, oh, this helps give us an exact date for the birth of the Messiah, because that's what's being described here in Revelation. And so basically goes through and says, all right, so the only time this works is, if I remember correctly, the birth of Jesus the Messiah is on September 11th, 3 BC.
Right.
Now,
So,
obviously, Martin writes this before the events of 9/11. So as much as Martin is trying to be a historian, he's definitely not trying to claim to be a prophet.
yeah.
Because that's a very bad timing on the part of Jesus if this is true.
So
now, oh, go ahead.
Carry on. Sorry. No, you carry on.
Yeah, so here's the thing. If we're going to try to interpret the story of Revelation as actual astronomy, there are some big problems, because basically after you read the first several verses about this birth taking place, what does it say? It says the woman comes down to earth and hides in the forest. The dragon comes chasing after her and spitting water at her, but the earth is opening up to catch that. This does not sound astronomical, does it? Has anyone seen a star dragon running around earth shooting water out of its face? No, because this is not astronomical. This is clearly something more symbolic or metaphorical of what John the Revelator is trying to reveal. And if we're going to be very specious about this, then we're not going to interpret anything else astronomical. It's very special pleading. There's also a few other things to notice, that while I have said the woman is supposed to be Virgo, now the thing is, it only refers to the woman as a woman. Does it say her name? No. Does it say anything about her marital status? No. Does anything say about her sexual status? No. So how do we know she's a virgin? We said so. That's it. Basically, it's with the assumption that, oh, this must be Mary, which is a common Catholic interpretation. But, when I'm reading the Gospels, there's something I notice. Mary isn't in space when she gives birth.
I don't know. Skeptics are such bar humbug.
I know. I'm terrible like that. I'm sorry. I don't see space ladies as much as I'd like to meet them.
So, keeping on the subject of the star then and astronomy, it said that the star, so this is from my public, was a Jupiter and Venus conjunction. Tough for that to come over a small house. And then again,
Indeed.
just to follow that on, plenty of planet star conjunctions, novae, comets, asteroids possible whenever you want. Take your pick. In no way do any of these phenomena point to a place on the Earth's surface. And then, of course, the classic one, which is, it's not reasonable to think a star can point out a particular house on Earth, unless said star was hovering about the altitude of a helicopter. So just quickly, I know we talked about this in the last interview with you, but for those who haven't seen that interview, just very quickly, what's your opinion on whether the star can be seen naturalistically or whether it has to be a supernatural star?
Yeah, so the question is, do we want to read Matthew for the words he uses or the words we wish he used? Because if you go by the language he uses, he is trying to, if anything, go out of his way to show this is not some sort of regular astronomical event. And this is also completely consistent with the entire history of the interpretation of this story from the 2nd century to the 18th century. It's only then does anyone start trying to fudge the numbers to try to make it fit anything other than something fantastical. Honestly, even the English translations don't capture as well as the original Greek does, because there's a few things that are constructed in Greek that really are saying, yes, the star was hovering right over the domicile that the whole family was in.
This is the NASB. So when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after they came into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. So this is the idea that the star, after hearing I'll read the whole lot actually. After hearing the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went on ahead of them until it came to a stop over the place where the child was to be found. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, and after they came into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. So what do you have to say about that as far as the Greeks concerned? Can you remember?
Yeah. So, so like this translation is definitely decent. I can't really say anything is wrong with it. It's just
Yeah.
that some of the important nuances or highlights that exist in the Greek kind of get lost. So, in particular, when it says it stood over where the child was, some will try to interpret that as, oh, the star was at zenith. It was just at the high point of the sky, which has the problem that you wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between in Jerusalem versus in Bethlehem. It would also have looked directly overhead. They didn't have tools so much that they could measure a thousandth of a milli-arcsecond to have noticed like the differences that you would need over that short sort of distance. And also, it's worth noting that when it says it stood, that's because before then the star was coming. It was coming, it arrived at a location and then stopped in place. And then it uses a construction which is only used to talk about something that is like right on top of or right above something. It's the same sort of construction you have for when Jesus is riding on a donkey. It's the same construction that's used for when the sign that is just above Jesus's head when he's being crucified. It's used for when the angel is sitting on top of the door or the stone that was rolled away from the tomb. That's the sort of construction we see over and over again. In other words, Matthew is not using astronomical verbiage to describe something high up in the sky. He's basically saying, no, this is literally down to earth what is going on. And so, like I say, you can either read it for what Matthew says, or you can read it for what you wish Matthew had said to make it consistent with astronomy. And then with all the various theories that are thrown out, when you actually go through and dig through it, can you actually extract anyone would have interpreted this messianically in any sort of way? Not so well. So, for example, it was mentioned the Jupiter and Venus conjunctions that Martin is so big up on about. And to Martin, it's just obvious that these conjunctions would have been super important. Now, how do we know how ancient people would have interpreted things? What would be the method we would use to find out what ancient people think about this? What would you think, Jonathan? How would you find out what ancient people think about something?
Well, you would go to texts written at the time, you know, inscriptions, archaeology, you know,
Perfect.
and you would cross-reference all of these.
Exactly. Now, what did Martin go to determine that a Jupiter-Venus conjunction would have been important and meaning the birth of someone? This is it.
His own posterior?
I was trying to be nicer, but yes, indeed. He pulls it out of nowhere. And if you actually go and look at the various astrological literature from the Babylonians and the Assyrians, their letters, their astrological texts, they actually tell you this sort of conjunction would mean the death of a king.
Yeah.
But guess what? Did Martin check? No. Could he have checked? Yes. But he decided not to.
Yeah. And so I think when you understand the Greek and when you understand the story as it's written by Matthew, it can only be a supernatural star. This really... and then you get onto problems of why did no one else see this star? Why is it not attested to anywhere else in a fairly astronomically astute society? Or at least, you know, people would be looking to the skies much more than they do nowadays and noticing things with a lack of like ambient light around that will light pollution. You know, these things are going to be far more remarkable. And yet nothing is mentioned anywhere. Is this what we'd expect given the truth of Matthew, or is this what we'd expect given the account that skeptics would present, which is that Matthew is not telling the truth? And of course, all of the other evidence or lack of evidence points to the negation of Matthew's historicity.
Exactly. Yes. And it's also worth noticing like how much more of the ancients were attuned with the sky. And I've actually been seeing it around this Christmas season because I've saw like through Twitter in particular, lots of people saying that they saw the Star of Bethlehem last week. And here's why they were thinking that, because last year there was a really close conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And it was all through the news and it caused a huge spike in interest in this idea of it being the Star of Bethlehem. Now, that was last year. People then were starting to repeat the headlines from last year and not realizing it was only for last year. And then people were expecting, oh, the Star of Bethlehem is going to show up on December 21st. And so they go out and they see a bright star in the east and they say, oh, that must be the Star of Bethlehem. And I look at the pictures, what they're posting, and I realize they're looking at Venus. They just don't know, because most people now with like light pollution and that, they don't know the skies. In fact, when it comes to the history of people interpreting the Star of Bethlehem, one of the major sources of what has caused that change has been the planetarium. And the reason planetariums were built in the first place is because of light pollution. People were literally losing the night sky, and a lot of astronomers wanted people to be able to reconnect with that again, even though they're city slickers. So how can we bring the sky and make it accessible to people, even if they're living within the city? That is like the birth of the planetarium in the 1920s, and then comes here to the US in the 1930s and is spread now throughout the world. And then eventually, from those places, they started producing the various programs to suggest, oh, this could have been the Star of Bethlehem and this or that. And ultimately fitting in with the ignorance of the audience that doesn't really know how the planets work anyways, on top of not being totally literate on the exact terminology of Greek being used by Matthew, which, to be fair, most people are not reading for tiny nuances about, oh, he's using the genitive here. Oh, that makes all the difference. Like, no one's doing that. Yeah. So there's a lot of history with why we even have these stories going on in the first place. And it's because of the general ignorance of the modern audience, which is a product of modern lighting, frankly.
Yeah. Before we get onto that, because that's the next segment of our talk, and that's where we'll end the talk, which is talking about astrotheology in general, but also what modern astronomers actually think, and people working in planetariums actually think, which is what you're going on to now. I just want to take us back a little bit to this point, because this is one of those very, very clear contradictions, which is when they saw the star, after they came into the house. So this is Jesus is existing or living in a house. Whether he was born in this house we're unsure, but he's certainly in a house now. And of course, when we go back to Luke, she gives birth to a firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. So here he's in a stable, one presumes. Some early church traditions think he is born in a cave, but there is a definite, or at least seems pretty prima facie obvious contradiction that Matthew has a house and Luke has a manger in a stable. Now, Christians will try and get around this to say, actually, when the Magi come, and I'd be interested to see what you think about this, that it's a couple of years after his birth, or at least some time after his birth. There's this idea that the Magi, they're established in Bethlehem now, and they're living in a house, and then the Magi come. But this doesn't really work with Luke, who says that they're down for a registration, for a census. She gives birth in a manger, and then very clearly Luke says, and straight away after they go back up. And this is a huge, this to me. And when I debated with Lydia McGrew, she actually, I think if I recall correctly, she pretty much conceded that this was a problem, which is the language that Luke uses, because the child's been born, the angels and the shepherds come, and then it goes to this. So this is what Luke says. And the shepherds went back, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, just as had been told them. Of course, we hear nothing about the shepherds, so they go back and apparently tell everyone and glorify. But no one knows about Jesus for another 30 years. And then we have, and when 8 days were completed. So this is very clear. There is no other way of reading this. 8 days pass after the shepherds leave, and we have Jesus's parents going, so that it was time for his circumcision. So he's a newborn baby, gets circumcised. It's all pretty normal. He was also named Jesus and then given to by the angel, blah, blah, blah. So when 8 days were completed, and when the days of their purification according to the law of Moses were completed, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. So 8 days later, they take him to Jerusalem. And then after that, after they had this little sacrifice of doves in Jerusalem, he gets circumcised. And when his parents had completed everything in accordance with the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth, so to where they already lived. Right. The reason why I'm spending a lot of time on this, I was meant to show that to you as well. So this is what Luke says. And when this happened, they went to Jerusalem. And when that happened, they went back to Nazareth. Very clear. There's no time for 2 years in Egypt, right? There just is no time, right? Yeah. What do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, and it is worth noting that, according to Matthew's account, that we have every reason to believe that the Magi are coming at least a year after the birth of Jesus. So if we're going to try to somehow force this into Luke's account as hard as we can, we actually make the entire census problem worse, because the idea that everyone has to go to their ancestral home for a census is already pretty mind-boggling bad. Now you have to stay there for a couple of years. You have just destroyed the entire Roman economy, all of the farming in the entire Roman Empire for multiple seasons. Everyone is dead from starvation. I am sorry. That only makes the situation all the worse.
It's insane. So the idea that for Roman taxation purposes, where they need to know exactly where people live and what their property is at the place where they live in order to tax them where they live. So each different taxation region can be registered correctly, and you could administer taxation properly. Right. Luke's version has everyone going to their ancestral homes. And then, if you, as you say, to marry it with the Matthean version, he's staying there for a couple of years. The Magi come and they go to Egypt, where they arguably stay for another couple of years and then go back to Nazareth for the first time. Luke has them going back to their own city very clearly, having come down from Nazareth. So this to me, that both chronology and geography of Nazareth, Bethlehem, Nazareth, or Bethlehem, Egypt, Nazareth, that is the most obvious and terminal problem for these two accounts in attempts to marry them, and I don't think it can be solved. Would you agree?
I usually find the solutions to be even worse than the problems they're trying to solve. If your solution requires the death to the entire Roman Empire, you probably have a bad solution.
And this is what my public says, which is Luke 2:39 is a mic drop. I agree here. I really do agree. I think this is probably the strongest problem. They went directly to Nazareth when he was 8 days old, not 2 years after asylum in Egypt and when the Magi came. But like, end of. That's, either you read Luke or you bastardize Luke and just change the meaning of all his sentences so that it doesn't mean what it obviously does mean. Absolutely. It's just a huge problem. Right. So I'm now going to allow you to get back to where you were going originally. Sorry, it's just that house problem. The house versus the manger and stable and no room at the inn is just a problem. If there's no room at the inn, it's because they're staying there temporarily, and they're staying there temporarily because they're going for a census registration, after which they will go straight back home. We don't get Matthew's house, and we don't get a large amount of time and then 2 years in Egypt as a political refugee. So interesting that most American evangelical Republicans want to build a big wall. I wonder if they did that in Egypt, whether there would be no Jesus. There you go. He would have been killed by Herod at the border because he couldn't get over the wall. Anyway, just a bit of politics in there. So going back to planetarians and astronomers, what's your view on what modern planetarium owners and people that run these shows and what modern astronomers think of trying to find out naturalistic theories for the Star of Bethlehem?
So to give a little bit of history to this, so before I started getting deep into the subject, my the person who wrote the foreword for my book, Bob Berman, who's also an astronomer and a person who tries to promote scientific literacy, astronomical literacy, back in the 90s, I think it was even back in the 80s, he was like anecdotally talking with people and finding out, most of the people working at the planetarium don't actually believe these hypotheses. And in fact, in the main journal for planetarium workers called The Planetarian, they did a poll back in the 80s of workers there and their opinions on the subject matter. And the biggest category of things was, none of these things actually work. So there's a moniker that actually planetarium workers use for the Star of Bethlehem. We like to call it the SOB.
Yep.
And because there's just, this general thing that's like, it's the thing we put out during the holiday season. We really don't buy into it. We're not all that interested into it. And the reason we're continuing to do it is it seems to make the audiences happy. There is some polling data that also seems to suggest that, that the average planetarium goer that goes to the Christmas shows are more religious than the average viewer. There was some polling that was done again back in the 80s to show that. And when I see the history of like the various writings from people all the way back in like the 20s and the 30s and things like that, and you see how they're describing the thing, they're basically like, we don't want to break it to them that, most people think this is, a bunch of hogwash. So let's be nice about it and say, well, here's some interesting possibilities, but, not come down strong and say, no, the thing is a miracle and you shouldn't believe it. or anything like that. They are trying to be.
You don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, right?
Yeah, it's basically that sort of mentality that, frankly, I think it's even more closer to the yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus sort of mentality, which obviously is just like that original letter from, what was it, 1908. It's infantilizing. And I would hope that after nearly 100 years, planetarium workers would allow their audiences to grow up.
Yeah, interesting. So when you were talking about this in a private conversation we had, I was saying that this is a really interesting parallel analog with or analogy with clergymen and women in the States, particularly, such as we saw with Breaking the Spell, Daniel Dennett's book. You know, in speaking to a lot of clergymen and women, it turns out that they a lot of them don't believe, and this is just a convenience for them, or like, you know, this is their job, and therefore they go through the ritual of saying these things and doing these things and appearing to believe, but actually they think it's nonsense as well. It just pays the bills, and it's their job.
Yeah. The thing, of course, I'll also point out with this is that it might seem difficult to let that sort of thing go, but there have been planetarians that used to have these sorts of shows for the holidays and then stopped doing them. So, like, for example, here in Boston, the Museum of Science has a planetarium. I know in the past they had shows about it because I can find historical records of it. But this holiday season, previous holiday seasons for at least several years, maybe decades, they haven't had a Star of Bethlehem show. And you know what didn't happen? A bunch of Bostonians didn't come in and start burning the place down. Instead, they went to a different show and nobody really made that big a fuss of it. I would say the same sort of thing when it comes to, like, those who are stuck, being clergy in that, like what the Clergy Project is doing. It might seem hard to step away from it, but people actually do a pretty darn good job of adapting.
Yeah, and you know what would be nice is if in one day in 20 years time you'd have a planetarium show which would be debunking the Star of Bethlehem as a naturalistic hypothesis. So it does the opposite, which is like,
well,
come along.
In some ways that might already be happening. So in one of the most recent issues of the Planetarian, the author there, and I've actually had some conversation with the author, she's working at a German planetarium, and she doesn't come out and say like it's total nonsense or that, but she says, if we're going to explain the show, let's explain it in terms of the use of astrology as political propaganda for the Roman emperor. In particular, say, well, here's how these conjunctions would have been of interest to Caesar Augustus and how then it might be used in the Christmas story. So it's a little more subversive in that sort of way.
Yeah. So how can you explain for the audience how astronomy was done maybe in the time of Jesus, and how astrology was done, and then we could segue into our last segment, which is talking about astrotheology and its importance for a lot of people in modern times in criticizing biblical narratives and stories, but where you think maybe astrotheology goes wrong. But we'll come on to that. So a little background very quickly on sort of astronomy and astrology in the biblical times.
Okay, yeah. So in antiquity, basically there was no distinction between the astronomer and the astrologer, because frankly, the reason you did astronomy for the most part was so you could do astrology.
Right.
In the most ancient systems that like the Babylonians, the Assyrians had, that the stars were signs of basically like the will of the gods, that if you could interpret them correctly, you can know if they're upset about something or they want you to prepare for something like this. It's like, oh, your king is in trouble. You better be doing something about this. Or, oh, you're going to win the next battle. A famine is going to come. Those were the sorts of things that they were looking at and trying to interpret ultimately as signs. For the Greeks, they started applying a more physical model of it because, one, they found out just how predictable the motions of the planets were. They weren't like random motions. Like the Babylonians were starting to develop some mathematical techniques to predict the locations of the planets and things like that. The Greeks produced an even more sophisticated model to the point they were building astronomical computers to be analogs for what they thought was happening in the sky. Like an analog computer is literally like this is supposed to be in analogy for what the planets are actually doing. And so with like the various gearing systems that they were producing, like which was found in like the Antikythera mechanism from, we think, the mid to late 1st century BC, it is trying to show this is how we think the sky actually works, and we use it to predict reasonably accurately where the planets are going to be at some future date.
This is like often cited as one of the earliest computers, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. It is. Yeah, it is definitely the oldest, like, clear artifact of an analog computer that we have.
Yeah.
And we only started going digital in the 20th century, for better or for worse. Well, I'll say for better, because you can't play Minecraft on an analog computer right now.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, but so yeah, the Greeks are trying to interpret it more physically rather than as signs, but actually as causes. There's a lot of back and forth if this even makes sense, how you're actually supposed to do this. And frankly, the best shot at astrology being scientific is happening at this time as well. Like, they're trying to say, like, here's like the physiochemical explanation for how the planets are affecting us. Here's how we're going to go and collect data to try to find out, like, okay, what does this conjunction mean? Or what does it mean when this planet's in retrograde? By basically trying to get a bunch of test cases and things like that.
Is this by looking at the stars to say these are natural things that have a regularity, but
Yes.
in that naturalism and regularity, there is agency, divine agency still?
Basically, they had started, like, moving it away from having that sort of, direct agency by God's pushing things around. So, I mean, this really in many ways goes back to Thales, the pre-Socratic philosopher, who often is argued as like the first philosopher in many ways, and the person who tried to, like, distinguish explaining things naturally versus supernaturally. But yeah, he started applying it, we think, originally to astronomy, and maybe also to like the flooding of the Nile. There's some evidence that might have actually where he got his sharpened his teeth on the ideas of naturalism, the predictions of the flooding of the Nile, which was always very regular.
Right.
He didn't have a very good explanation for it, as best we could tell, but nonetheless, the idea of everything is, like, happening based on some sort of natural law. And yes, they were using the word law to describe things back then. There were natural laws in antiquity. It wasn't just an invention of the scientific revolution. It was a rediscovery. In particular, like, our word for law is, like, we give credit to this to Rene Descartes, who himself got it from Lucretius, who uses the word law to describe various things going on in the world. So, like I said, they're more or less trying to have naturalistic theories of how astrology works. And if you have a very good astronomical system, then you can, well, predict the future.
So when biblical Jews were looking up at the skies in Jesus' time, in the context of the Jesus sort of history, what were they thinking when they looked up at the stars?
It was, again, a bit of a mess, because if you read the Talmud, the one thing you'll learn is that if you're looking for agreement among Jews, you're not going to find it in the Talmud.
Yeah. I think we can learn that pretty much. About anything.
Yeah, and like any modern rabbi has to, like, the Talmud is gigantic. There's multiple versions of it, and a good rabbi will just about have memorized it to learn not what is true, but basically how to make even more arguments about every little bit of minutia. Yeah. And you see in the Talmud back and forth about whether astrological forces are even real or not. Or do they affect only Gentiles and not Jews? If they do affect Jews, to what degree? To what degree should we incorporate it in terms of our medicine? What degree do we need to learn astronomy to work the calendar? Because for the longest time, the way the Jewish calendar worked and when you're going to start the new year was based on actual optical observations, not predetermined calculations, as the modern Hebrew calendar works, which was established some centuries after the time of Jesus. So, and again, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see there's interest in astrology, but we can't reconstruct how they did astrology very well. How much are they actually, like, borrowing from the Greco-Roman system versus older Babylonian systems? It's not absolutely clear what they're doing, and how much of it just is their own innovations. Because the old way of doing astrology is that basically the way you interpret what's going on in the skies isn't through careful empirical analysis and looking for correlations. Frankly, the way astrology worked for the Babylonians is that the universe runs on puns. You basically are looking for wordplay and correlations in that sort of way, and say, oh, well, this thing is kingly and this thing that is watery, so we connect the two in that sort of metaphor. Or there's this word that describes this sort of event, and we get these sort of play on words. And it even gets kind of ridiculous because there is literal predictions of what to expect in these, like, Babylonian astrological manuals of when you see the sun in certain conditions. And in particular, there's this one case where it says, when you see the sun at midnight, it predicts this. Right. That's clearly not based on an observation.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, there's looking at the skies and understanding the regularity, which then is obviously taken in the context of the annual cycle and what's going on with the seasons and knowing where you are in the year with what's going on up there. And then
and some Jews would, they're definitely like seeing, those sorts of regularities, but they also think ultimately God is sovereign. He can do whatever he wants. There is some texts that basically have Abraham observing the stars, looking up, and, some will say that Abraham started astrology, but in this text it says he looked at the stars and he said, well, God is sovereign. If he wants it to rain, it won't matter what the stars do. So bugger all that.
Yeah, so like linking rain to the stars and all sorts of stuff. But and then seeing things that are not regular, like comets and like conjunctions and all these other things that aren't regular in the sense of an annual regularity, then portend to all sorts of things, often negative, as you talked about before, which is if you are presenting that they are the theory that the Magi were following a comet, and this is a good thing, then that's a bit of a problem, because comets are actually more often seen as bringing about bad things. And the Zoroastrians were pretty, actually, like you said in the myth vision discussion, they were people who were very dubious. They were very, they thought that astrology, astronomy was kind of a negative thing rather than a sort of positive thing. So they would be the last people to follow a star to find out a newborn king. Do you want to just touch on that very slightly and repeat yourself from what you said?
Right, yeah. So in the earliest the earliest records of the Zoroastrians, in the what's called the Avesta literature. Avesta is like this very ancient Persian language, and the reason we can date it is because of the antiquity of this language. In the same way, people date parts of the Bible based on the antiquity of the Hebrew or Aramaic use. Same sort of technique. The oldest strata of Zoroastrian writing we have has no interest at all in the planets. It has almost no interest in the stars. There's basically some hymns to the sun, the moon, and the star Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. And beyond that, it basically shows like no interest in those. In some of the later literature in the Pahlavi language, also called Middle Persian, roughly at the very rough time of like the Roman Empire and that, we see that their reaction to the planets is to make them demons, because they have these irregular motions. They are going against the other stars. They seem to stop and move backwards. Anything that had those sort of irregular motions, they thought was corrupted by Ahriman, the original Satan. And when I say original, as in the original opponent to the all-good God, Ahriman basically is absorbed in Jewish mythology to turn their Satan into this ultimate fighter of God, rather than just his lieutenant. The original Satan is just supposed to be an accuser, a prosecutor, and then eventually he evolves into the embodiment of evil and the ultimate opponent of Yahweh. That is because of interactions with Zoroastrianism. So when the Zoroastrians are telling us the planets, because of their erratic motions, the comets, because of their erratic motions, those are things controlled by Ahriman. They say that meteors, when they come down, those are actually brought down by witches. Basically anything with those very fast, irregular, unexpected motions that aren't like nice and smoothly predictable, like the phases of the moon or the motion of the sun, those are all evil bodies. And this doesn't really change until pretty much the end of antiquity, like pretty much like right before the conquest of Islam. Is there any like acceptance of astrology within Zoroastrianism?
So, and the problem being that Matthew is presenting Zoroastrianism, like you talked about before, because people think of Zarathustra and they think Zoroaster. They think Aster meaning star in Greek. Is that right?
Yep.
So they think, well, these guys must know about, I mean, this is a theory, but you think these guys, it might be that Matthew thinks, oh, these guys know a lot about astronomy because, hey, they've got star in their name. But actually, the reality of history is that these guys are really skeptical and very negative about anything to do with the heavens, thinking that indeed they pretended to sort of negative things, and therefore the story that Matthew presents is even less likely to be historically true.
Exactly. And it is worth noting these sorts of like word mistakes the Greeks would make. This was pretty common, where they have all these like fanciful etymologies to try to derive things. So for example, the Greeks would believe that the Amazonian warriors were missing a breast because Amazon sounds like a mastectomy, missing like removing one breast. That's how they were hearing that word. And so the Amazonians were missing one or both of their breasts so that way they could shoot arrows better, which, by the way, is also completely stupid. Breasts don't get in the way when you're shooting arrows. So it's completely divorced from any sort of reality. And this was extremely common for the Greeks and the Romans. And it seems like Matthew just went along with that because he didn't know better.
Don't let that get in the way of a good story.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's have a little chat. I know it's not necessarily to do with the Nativity, but I get the sense that modern a lot of people watching this maybe, and even live or after it goes onto YouTube permanently, are fans of astrotheology in explaining a lot of the biblical data or a lot of the narratives and stories in the Bible. And I personally, I think things like the Samson story are astrotheological in nature. By point of fact, I think that the Samson story is a solar myth that has been co-opted and brought into the Bible and doesn't really have a particularly coherent place in the Bible, other than if you understand it as a solar myth. But I think there are a lot of people who will take the astrotheological position to a much greater degree and say, well, actually, astrotheology explains almost all of what's in the Bible in some way or another. What is astrotheology? How would you define it? And what's your position on astrotheology explaining the Bible?
Yeah. I try to be a bit careful with the terminology because I want to distinguish between astrotheology, astrology, and just stuff that has to do with heaven. Yeah. Because you can have all sorts of discussions about heaven, but it doesn't actually correspond to what we actually see happening in the sky. After all, like the idea that there are all these layers of heaven that angels are moving up and down in, and battling demons in that. Well, you look up on a given night, and how many demons do you see fighting angels? Somewhere in the vicinity of 0. Yeah. So I like to distinguish this, and also astrology from astrotheology, because especially for the Greeks, that astrology becomes relatively scientific, about as scientific as it gets, really. And even with the Babylonians, that it's about interpreting the motion of the skies. The thing that I would like to call astrotheology is creating stories about the gods or legendary figures, and it's based on the objects that you see in the sky and their particular motions. And there are some cases where we do seem to see that sort of thing happening. So I'll give one very ancient example. In one of the myths of Inanna or Ishtar, the story is that
these are gods of what culture?
So this would be the Sumerians and the Babylonians. Yeah. So, and this myth is like maybe like 4,000-ish years old, 4,000 years old, very ancient, even older than the Bible. She takes a nap by a tree. A man comes along, sees the most beautiful thing in the universe, and decides to do what you would do with the most beautiful thing in the universe, and then run off because he realizes, how much trouble he's going to be when she wakes up. She wakes up, is absolutely enraged, and is trying to find the person who, unfortunately, if I say the word of what happened, I don't know if that'll get us demonetized, honestly. So I'm trying to avoid the language. But she is upset, and she is trying to find this person, and this person is just going and trying to hide in the city. And it says that she's only like looking in the mountains in the east and the west, which is a bit weird. Why doesn't she look elsewhere? And like this goes on through a long time until that there's literally the earliest Deus Ex Machina we can find in ancient literature, where she's given the power to basically fly overhead and look down in the city where this guy is hiding, and then say, "There you are, you little dwarf. Now you're in trouble." So why is it she's only hanging on the eastern or western mountains and things like that? Because Inanna is connected to the planet Venus, and you only ever see Venus rising in the east or setting in the west. You actually never see it at night high up in the sky. So this seems to be capturing that sort of knowledge about the motions of this particular planet. And it literally takes a miracle for that to fix that, because you normally don't see Venus high up in the sky able to look down.
Stories like that, etiological, which means that are they stories to explain the phenomena of the star Venus, or sorry, the planet Venus in the sky at these 2 points? Therefore, we know that Venus only does that. So the Babylonians say, we know they only do that, so we need to explain that. And the story gets developed in order to explain the phenomenon.
Right. Yeah. So that, I think, is a clear example of someone doing something astrotheological. Now, And the reason we can also suppose they do this is because we look at the various literature from the Sumerians and the Babylonians, and they were really interested in the night sky. They're talking about all sorts of things like happening up in the sky, the constellations having all this sorts of importance. They're very clear that they have this interest. If we go to the Hebrew Bible and I ask you, how many planets does it even talk about? You're going to come up pretty shorthanded. Like, for example, the book of Job is probably the book that has like the greatest amount of like astronomical knowledge. And basically it mentions a couple of constellations and that's it. If you look to Isaiah, it talks about the fall of the morning star, which is, somewhat a reference to Venus. But even there, it's in reference to the king of the Babylonians basically being thrown low. So it's barely even touching anything in the sky. And the other planets, we don't have mentions of them, or at least not clear ones. It seems like there's actually a lack of that sort of direct interest in Hebrew literature, not to mention all the condemnations of star worship.
So you would say that actually some skeptics who put a lot of store in astrotheology in the context of the Hebrew Bible are stretching things a little bit too far.
I would say so. And, there are some things that, you might be interested in and say, hey, maybe this could have some explanatory power. But I find that it gets pretty thin pretty quickly. And the idea that astrotheology explains so much, you find out it doesn't do that very well because, well, if this is supposed to like be, especially like in movies like Zeitgeist, this is supposed to be like the original myth that's just basically copy pasted into all other world mythologies, then it begs the question, okay, in this sort of system where the sun is supposed to be like the most important thing in the universe, well, you go over to Greece and you look at the Greek gods and you look at the Olympians. Which one of the Olympians is the sun god? None of them. Helios isn't in the top 12. He's not one of the Olympians. In Roman culture, Sol doesn't really become an important god until the 3rd century AD. Right. For the longest time, he's a god, but he's nowhere near as important as Jupiter or Minerva or other gods like that. He's low tier for most of his existence as far as we can tell. So if we're trying to explain everything about the motions of the sun, it seems like, well, then why is the sun one of the least important of the deities compared to all these other ones? Like, why is he less important than Neptune or Demeter or Athena, things like that? You barely, you have some stories about Helios in Greek myth, but he doesn't have near the importance until like towards the end of antiquity. So that's already kind of a weird thing. And then we come back to the Bible and we say, okay, let's explain everything about the motions of the sun. So the name Samson, yes, it is derivative of the sun. But beyond that, how much else of the Samson story can we explain with that? It doesn't get us very far. Like some will try to argue, well, when Samson kills a lion and like, rips it in half with his bare hands, this is the constellation Leo. But it doesn't explain details like, well, why is Leo being killed? Why does the body start decomposing and start producing honey that gets collected? And that becomes a riddle that Samson decides to tell at a party. A lot of details don't get explained.
Yeah,
really
I've written. I wrote some notes on that. I won't bring up now because now's not the time. But I did write some notes after reading Tim Callahan's Secret Origins of the Bible, which is a fantastic book, actually. Hugely detailed, but I'm quite convinced that Samson is a solar myth, and actually that there is loads, and even linking to the honey ideas of honey. I just can't remember it offhand now, but okay. there are loads of elements, and it'd be interesting to see if you would be in agreement with that. I'll send that to you. Okay. And this idea that Samson it represents the sun and Delilah represents the moon, and the kind of, as his hair represents the rays of sun and his strength, and as that is sort of cut off, then he loses his strength, and this kind of represents the sun versus the moon, so on and so forth. Anyway, but the point is, but the broader point that we're trying to make is that some people, see a lot more astrotheology in the Bible than is really there. Is that right?
Yeah, and especially when they're going to try to incorporate it with like the precession of the equinoxes, or the sun moving through the zodiac in general, especially because here's an interesting thing. So
just before you go on, as we're sort of rounding up and sort of moving towards the end of the talk, if you've got any questions, super chats, anything like that, hugely appreciated as they are. Just get them in quickly because we'll start running out of time. But sorry, carry on.
Okay, no worries. So So, like, for example, like, and again, this is coming up, like, in particular in Zeitgeist, and the idea of, like, the sun moving through the zodiac is supposed to explain various Old Testament and New Testament stories. The thing is, though, we actually know much more about the history of the zodiac, and it's nowhere near as ancient as it would need to for this sort of thing to work. So, in particular, if I ask you how many zodiac signs there are, what is your answer?
Well, I know that there was all, whole thing in the news recently that there's actually 13 and the one extra one on there.
Okay, and now here's the thing. There are indeed 13 constellations that the sun will go through, but a constellation isn't the same thing as a sign.
Yeah.
Even though they have the same name. And the reason for that is that when the Babylonians invented the zodiac system, they first off wanted 12 instead of 13 because there are 12 full lunar cycles in one calendar year. In fact, our word our word month is ultimately derived from moon.
Right.
We have 12 moons in a year.
Right.
And this is also, like, generally culturally true. So that's the astronomical fact for 12. So that's one reason they want to have 12 signs rather than 13. And also, there's something weird about signs that also skeptics get wrong, unfortunately. Signs are not the same as constellations, in a big part also because they're all the same size. They're all 30 degrees of arc length. And here's the thing. The various constellations themselves are hugely different in size. Virgo is like one of the largest constellations in the sky, and Aries, the ram, is one of the smallest. But in a zodiac, they're both exactly the same size.
So, I mean, treat me like I know nothing, because actually I know nothing about this. Because so when you were talking about 30 degrees, so 360 degrees divided by 12 is 30 degrees. So does each sign represent a portion of the sky that you look up at, and there is a constellation of stars in that area of the sky that you then say that this represents a period of time?
Yes and no. And the reason I say yes and no is because it's also the case that the locations of the signs don't match the locations of the constellations. That where you actually set those borders, there's a bit of arbitrariness to it. And there was multiple systems that the Babylonians had that differed by a few degrees. The Greeks would argue whether the edge point between the constellations of Aries and Pisces, should that be at where the sun is on the vernal equinox, or should it be somehow based on where the actual stars are? The version with the vernal equinox is the one that wins out. So in other words, if you look at, like, astrology software to tell you where the planets are, and then you try looking out with your naked eye, you're going to have no success. Because where the signs are and the constellations are not the same. They're not even the same bodies. They're not the same size. If you try navigating by that, you're just going to be lost completely. And I bring all of this up because this sort of astrological technology was something the Babylonians invented to actually make their own astrological prediction systems a bit easier. Because if you make all the signs the same size, it becomes a lot easier to work things out. It makes the whole tracking system much easier. But we also know when the system was developed, and the most recent research suggests it was developed around 400 BC.
Right, so fairly late in terms of certainly Babylonian history, but fairly late in terms of antiquity anyway.
Exactly, yeah. So, for example, then it becomes hard to use the idea of the sun going through the zodiac explains the story of Samson, because the Samson story is centuries before the zodiac was invented.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so thank you. That's almost a little soupçon, a little taste of astrology, and it's been a long time since I've considered astrology and my own star sign of Libra, because obviously I'm balanced or something nonsense, and I must like this sort of person, and you can predict my life just by looking in a newspaper. So that's fantastic. Well done to astrology. We have Festering Boils. always a lovely name to throw up there. So Festering Boils says, Jason Fu said there are zodiac symbols in ancient Jewish temples. What's up with that?
All right, so if we're going to say ancient, we do need to be a bit careful. So there are, in not temples but synagogues, zodiacs on the floor. And the earliest example of a zodiac floor in a synagogue comes from the 4th century AD. So this is a little bit late. And in fact, that earliest zodiac that we actually found It looks like it was probably actually put there by Gentiles. Like it's in a synagogue, but it was probably actually built by Gentiles because all the zodiac figures look like their Greek counterparts, including that they're naked, and the guys with their bits out are not circumcised. So in other words, this is not the sort of thing you expect from a Jewish craftsman. So it sounds like they probably they included it in their synagogue in the 4th century, and later on, the later ones like at Beit Alta, which is one that is shown a lot, that you'll see pictures of this Jewish zodiac. That one is much more in line with Jewish sensibilities, like everyone's not naked for one thing. Details like that. And it looks like that, it's there on the floor. It's not a place of worship. It's basically there for its like, symbolic purpose of like, here's the cosmos, which of course is ultimately controlled by, by Yahweh, or a little less nicely, Big Sky Daddy. It's not so much that they are using it for worship purposes or watching the sun move through the signs or things like that, which these floor patterns couldn't do anyways. It's a painting. You don't use a painting for navigation or for predictions. I don't get a copy of the Mona Lisa expecting her to actually wink at me. So
yeah. It's great having you on, Aaron, because I mean that's a great amount of knowledge that you've brought to the table here in answering Festering Balls. That's fantastic. Thank you for that, and thanks for the question. That's really cool, and we can get some clarity on the matter. I find it interesting. I did an interview recently with Kip Davis, Dr. Kip Davis, who's got expertise in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's fascinating how late the Tanakh, which the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, it was compiled and was written and redacted and pieced together and then universalized or given a kind of uniform scenario whereby you would have the same Tanakh, and that happened really late. And we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, which go from sort of 250 BCE up through to the 1st and 2nd century CE, and there's still a massive variety in the written documents that are found there. Absolutely fascinating that. And then when you go back, and we talked a little bit about the Elephantine papyri, which are these bits of writing from 650 BCE, which show absolutely no reference to some of the what we would think would be obviously biblical narratives and stories and the patriarchs and all these things that Christian literalists and Jewish literalists would say have been around for thousands of years and were written by Moses all the way back in 1500 BCE, 650 BCE. They've got no knowledge, no sort of working knowledge where you would expect it, and no reference to any of the early biblical stuff at all. And that's fascinating. You think, well, actually, this really was a late, the whole Jewish faith was as higher critics or biblical critics would say, was written in the exilic period, as the Jews were exiled in Babylonia. And then there was only very little that pre-existed that, and maybe a lot of oral stuff. But, this idea that actually a lot of it did come late. And here you are talking about, late zodiac and temples and stuff is just a lot later than I think. If you take on this Jewish orthodoxy and Christian orthodoxy, you just assume that everything's been in place and uniform since the word dot, since the year dot. And it's just not the case.
Yeah. And I know this will also probably tie to one of your upcoming future projects when it comes to the Exodus story. It's very hard, to date exactly when the final composition of the story exists. Is it pre or post-exilic, or even later still than that? It's very hard to determine. But usually also what's considered the oldest part of the Exodus story, the Song of the Sea, based on the dating of the Hebrew of it, that's supposed to be the oldest. But you also look at that, and it also looks mythological. It looks like the victory of Yahweh over the sea and combating the sea monster, which is not the Exodus story. And it just makes me wonder, I'm going to be curious what you do with your analysis for your book on the Exodus, because when that comes out, I'm wondering how much of this is memory of a couple of slaves leaving Egypt and then it blowing up from that versus here's our original myth. And now later Jewish scribes are demythologizing it and turning it into the epic narrative that we now know it.
Both, you're talking about the Song of the Sea, which looks like, so there's some interesting analysis there, and we're going to go off on one for a little bit, but there's interesting linguistic analysis, which it looks like it's old Hebrew language, but then you also have a technique of writing things in old Hebrew language to make it look like it's old, and so that you get these theories of like, this is an oldest. So some people say this is the oldest sort of piece of scripture, if you like, and then other people saying actually it was written to look old, but actually it was newer than we might be thought. But is it part of this sort of Baal mythology to do with storm gods and defeating the sea, and this was then co-opted. I think John Collins talks about this, about how the desert becomes the sea basically, and it gets written into the Exodus, and so it looks like it's part of the Exodus myth, but it actually isn't. And loads of stuff around that. It's really interesting. I love the Exodus
that is the one thing I have not been able to research well, of how easy or difficult is it to mimic old Hebraic style. Like if I'm trying to like mimic Shakespearean style, it'll probably stand out that I don't know what I'm doing. So I've heard like other Hebraists say that it's too difficult to do that and do it authentically, but I don't have the knowledge base to question that. So I'm very curious to see where the chips fall.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as with a lot of the Hebrew Bible, I think it is a case of co-opting the sort of Canaanite pantheon and other divine myths into the Yahweh myth, and you can see that evolution throughout the Bible. I think throughout the Hebrew Bible, as far as it being written by Moses, never going to happen.
Right. Oh, and also to, I guess, bring us back to topic, when it comes to the changing of stories, I'll also want to give a taste for, like I say, what my future upcoming book project stuff are. So the hypothesis I'm trying to generate, that there may be an older version of the Star of Bethlehem story behind Matthew's account, but it is truly mythological. It isn't even legendary. It is literally out of this world taking place. And if I'm right, I'm able to explain weird things like, why is Jesus called a star?
Right. Is that from Greek mythology?
It will actually, I'm actually finding the greatest evidence for that as in interpretation of the Old Testament. But there's also an account for that, because the idea, especially that the dead will become stars, is something that originates in Greco-Roman culture. And then we see it come into Jewish culture, like in the book of Daniel. The idea of astral immortality first arrives there, and we do see it in more later Jewish texts as well. But there are also like these various stories that say Jesus literally is a star, and no one has explained that very well yet. So I have to fix that problem.
Yay! Well done, you. Awesome. Well, I look forward to that. Look, can I just say, first of all, thank you so much to all the people who have watched this live. Thank you particularly to those like Festering Boils, who have thrown in some really generous donations, fantastic donations, all of you. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful live stream, this, in terms of both contributions for all of you guys, which keep us doing this, certainly myself, but Aaron, hopefully you will go out and buy his book, because it is a fantastic book, and it's one of those books that you might look at and say it's about the Star of Bethlehem. That's obviously obviously a myth, right? Matthew's making it up. I don't really need to read that. It's so niche. Yeah, it is a niche book, but man, this is actually this is so important. Like I said about this before, it's so important that you can undo the Star of Bethlehem, because it undoes the whole of the nativity of Matthew. Like once you pull apart the Star of Bethlehem, you have no Magi. You have no Magi following a star, which means you don't get Herod, which means you don't get the slaughter of the innocents, which means you don't get Jesus going across to Egypt, which means you don't get Jesus coming out of Egypt to fulfill the Mosaic prophecy that Matthew wants. The whole of that's nonsense. And when you see the whole of the Matthean infancy narrative being nonsense, then what about the rest of the Matthew's gospel? It's real, and there's so much like interesting science in here that talks you through like the evolution of science and astronomy. It's such a wonderful book. Please go out and get it, everyone. It's brilliant.
Thank you for that plug. I
agree.
It always feels a little embarrassing.
Yeah, no, but you know, everyone that's read it, in our discipline or in our neck of the woods, seems to think it is the book that I am claiming it is. And and we look forward to an extended version of that book coming out at some point in the future. Is that right? Are you adding to it?
Yeah, whether it's going to be a second edition or a completely separate book, it's ultimately going to probably matter of what I finally form and what is sellable.
Yeah.
It's an argument I'm having with myself, and like most arguments with myself, I tend to lose.
Yeah. Have you got your book where you have contributed to the academic tome at all there? Because that's
yes.
a great...
So I actually have a few different tomes here. So I've been actually publishing on the Star of Bethlehem since 2007, when I first published a relatively short article in Sky and Telescope, basically saying, guys, stop it. And that caused a fair bit of response. But my first academic thing was in the journal Zygon, the Journal of Science Religion, where I basically go through the whole history of the subject. Then, of course, you talked me into writing this book, and thank you for doing that, because it led to more good things. Let's see. A few years ago, I contributed one chapter to John Loftus' book, Christianity in the Light of Science. So
I've got a chapter in that on free will, actually.
Yes, right. Book. Yeah, so we worked with that as well. Let's see here. Yes. And so this is the Brill volume that I was involved with. This was at a conference at the University of Groningen back in 2014. It was also to take place on the 400th anniversary of Kepler's writing on the subject. So there were multiple reasons to do it then, and it was a great trip there. I was a funny anecdote from there. So it was a 3-day conference, and I give the third talk there. And after I give my talk and show why none of these things sort of work, I sit down, and the person next to me says, "Okay, I think we're done."
Lovely, brilliant. Drop mic. The conference is closed. Yeah. Aaron Adair has just obviously shown it's all a nonsense.
Yeah, and when it comes to affordability, so this you can get on Amazon in either digital or print form, relatively cheap. If you get the hardcover or cover Brill volume, you either have to buy this or pay the rent. You can't do both. There is a paperback version that is cheaper, but still, Brill is almost criminally expensive for all of their major works.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, fantastic, and I look forward to any new work in the future. As I said before, check out his blog, his website, draaronadair.com, and his book, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View, on Amazon. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Aaron. It always is. What do you think the last thing you would like to say on the Nativity, if anything? Is there anything that you think we've missed? Anything you'd like to add? Last chance, Lou.
So if anyone is really trying to find the Star of Bethlehem, you're not going to find the skies above. You're going to find it on the pages below. And when you search there, it becomes a far more interesting and a far more beautiful object than the imaginations of people trying to put it in the heavens.
I think that sums up biblical literalism as a whole. So when you start moving away from being a Christian or Orthodox Jew, this is particularly the case. Actually, no, for the Old Testament and New, Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, I think that when you look at these texts as weaving in all these sources and all these theologies and symbologies, they become so much more awe-inspiring, because actually the work of these authors is so creative and so brilliant in terms of, you can see that what they're doing with their literary mechanisms and with their intertextuality. There's a different kind of wonder that you get out of looking at these texts than you do if you are a literalist looking at them going, these must be true, these are just historical accounts of reality. And yeah, so I think that's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Adair. Thank you so much, all of you guys listening. You are wonderful. You take care, and we are going to hit the new year, and there'll be some new content either before then or after, or both. In the meantime, take care, question everything, including and almost even more importantly, yourselves. Thanks, Aaron. You take care.
Thank you.